The scent of freshly baked bread and warm cinnamon rolls filled the small corner bakery as Adele moved swiftly behind the counter, tying a knot in her apron with the precision of someone who had done it 1,000 times. The morning rush was well underway, businessmen grabbing black coffee, mothers balancing toddlers and croissants, students ordering pastries with sleepy voices. She worked through it all with a smile, her hands deftly assembling orders, her voice polite but quick. Speed was everything in the morning shift. Her manager, a stout woman named Francine, shouted over the noise, "Adele, honey, table 4 needs a refill." She grabbed the coffee pot without missing a beat, weaving through the crowd like she was born to do this. In truth, she wasn't. Years ago, she had imagined a different kind of life, one where she and Merrick built something together, where she didn't have to count every dollar before buying groceries. But imagining didn't pay bills, so she worked. At precisely 7:30 a.m., she untied her apron, grabbed her coat, and exchanged a quick nod with Francine before rushing out the door. She didn't have time to linger, not with the school bell minutes away from ringing. The cold morning air nipped at her cheeks as she hurried down the sidewalk, her breath visible in the crisp autumn air. The school was only a few blocks away, but even so, she checked the time on her phone twice, as if she could will the minutes to stretch longer. Iris was waiting for her by the front gate, her backpack slightly askew, a peanut butter smudge on the sleeve of her coat. Adele reached out automatically, brushing at the stain with her thumb. "What happened?" "Liam was showing me his jelly sandwich, and it exploded," Iris explained with the kind of exaggerated sigh only a 9-year-old could muster. Adele gave a small chuckle. "Sounds dramatic." "It was," Iris insisted. The morning routine was like clockwork, adjusting her daughter's backpack straps, smoothing stray hairs, making sure her lunch was packed. It was a dance of small gestures, ones that made her feel grounded even when everything else felt chaotic. She bent down slightly. "You good?" Iris nodded. "Yeah. But, Mom?" Her daughter's voice was quieter now, hesitant. "Are you coming home early tonight?" Adele's stomach twisted. The question was simple, but the answer never was. She hated this part, having to choose between making enough money and being home in time to hear about art projects and playground gossip. "I have to work late, sweetheart. But Grandma is making spaghetti, and I left you a note in your lunchbox." Iris nodded like she was trying to be mature about it, but Adele could see the disappointment flicker in her eyes. After a quick hug, she stood and watched as her daughter joined the stream of kids heading inside, her bright pink jacket standing out among the sea of navy and gray. As Adele turned back toward the bakery, her gaze landed on the groups of parents lingering outside the school gates. A father adjusting his son's collar, a mother handing her daughter an extra snack, a couple standing close together as they waved their twins inside. She didn't resent them, life was just what it was, but on mornings like these, she couldn't help but wonder what it would be like if things had been different. Back at the bakery, the crowd had thinned out. She poured herself a lukewarm cup of coffee, leaning against the counter for just a moment. Next to the register, a framed photo of Merrick sat on the shelf. It had been there for years now, positioned in a way that made it easy to glance at between orders. His eyes, frozen in that familiar grin, looked back at her like nothing had ever changed. She traced the edge of the frame with her fingertip. "Guess what? Iris has a peanut butter stain on her coat again," she murmured, almost like she expected an answer. But there was none. There never was. Her break ended before she had the chance to drink more than a few sips of coffee. She tucked the frame back into place and returned to work. There was always more work. Merrick sat on the edge of their thrift store couch, one knee bouncing as he tapped the edge of a pregnancy test box with his thumb. Across from him, Adele paced the length of their small apartment, arms crossed, jaw tight. The white stick rested on the bathroom counter, a silent verdict waiting to be read. "Shouldn't we check?" he asked, his voice half nervous, half hopeful. Adele exhaled, tilting her head toward the ceiling. Not yet. Let it finish, whatever it does. He chuckled, running a hand through his hair. It doesn't need encouragement. It's not a soufflé. She shot him a look, but there was no real bite in it. This was supposed to be exciting. They were supposed to be laughing, hugging, maybe even crying happy tears. Instead, the air between them felt thick with unspoken questions neither of them dared to voice. A few more seconds passed before Adele finally disappeared into the bathroom. Merrick stayed put, listening for any kind of reaction, gasp, squeal, nervous laughter, but there was only silence. Then, her voice, steady but quiet. It's positive. His body moved before his mind caught up, feet carrying him to her. Adele stood frozen, the pregnancy test still in her hand, staring at the tiny, unmistakable pink lines. Merrick wrapped his arms around her waist, pressing his forehead against her temple. We're having a baby, he whispered, letting the words settle between them. She leaned into him, just for a moment, before pulling back slightly. Merrick, how are we going to do this? He pulled away to look at her, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. We'll figure it out. Will we? Her voice was laced with something he didn't want to name, doubt, fear, the crushing weight of reality. We barely make rent. We stretch groceries. You're picking up extra shifts at the tour company, and I. Merrick took her hands, squeezing them gently. We'll find a way. We always do. Adele wanted to believe him. She wanted to let herself be wrapped up in his optimism, the same way she had been when they were younger, when love felt like enough. But love didn't pay hospital bills. Love didn't make landlords more forgiving. Love didn't stock diapers and formula. She pressed her lips together, then forced herself to nod. Okay. And just like that, they made space for joy. The worries didn't disappear, but they stepped aside, just long enough for her to feel the corners of her mouth lift as Merrick picked her up, spinning her around the tiny bathroom. Just long enough for them to let themselves believe that maybe, just maybe, everything would work out. The letter arrived in the mail exactly 6 months later. Adele found it wedged between a takeout menu and an envelope labeled urgent, which she was fairly certain was just another past due notice from the electric company. She unfolded the paper slowly, scanning the words before the meaning clicked. Rent was going up. Not just a little. Not just enough to make things slightly tighter, but significantly, so much so that she had to read it twice to be sure she wasn't misunderstanding. She sat heavily onto the kitchen chair, her fingers tightening around the letter. Their building wasn't fancy, not even close. The water pressure was inconsistent, the heater worked most of the time, and the neighbors argued loudly enough to make the walls shake. But it was home. Merrick walked in a few minutes later, tossing his backpack onto the couch. Hey, you hungry? I passed that taco truck on the way home, and... She held up the letter, cutting him off. It's happening again. His brow furrowed. What? The rent. It's going up. Again. He took the paper from her hands, scanning it quickly before exhaling sharply. Are they serious? This place barely justifies what we're paying now. Adele ran a hand through her hair. It doesn't matter. We either come up with the extra money, or we have to move. Again. Moving meant deposits, fees, boxes, and exhaustion. Moving meant leaving behind the worn-in comfort of their apartment, the space where they had imagined raising their baby. Merrick dropped into the chair across from her, rubbing the bridge of his nose. I'll talk to the guys at work, see if I can get more shifts. Maybe there's an off-season project I can help with. She bit her lip. I can try picking up more hours at the bakery. You're already working too much, he said immediately, shaking his head. She looked at him across the table, exhaustion evident in the dark circles under his eyes. So are you. He let out a dry chuckle. Yeah, well, that's what we signed up for, isn't it? Adele leaned back, pressing her fingers against her temples. This wasn't the plan. We were supposed to be settling in, getting ready for the baby, not scrambling to stay afloat. Merrick reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice soft but certain. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. But the numbers in her head didn't add up, and no amount of optimism would change that. The call came just after noon, while Adele was stacking clean plates in the cafe's kitchen, the hum of the lunch rush still echoing through the walls. She didn't recognize the number, but something about it made her stomach tighten. She wiped her hands on her apron before answering, tucking the phone between her ear and shoulder as she reached for another plate. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was steady, but she could hear the strain behind it. "Mrs. Calloway?" Her hands stilled. Hardly anyone called her that. It was always Adele. "Yes?" "This is Officer Talbot with the Summit Ridge Search and Rescue Team. Your husband, Merrick Calloway, there's been an accident." The plate slipped from her fingers, shattering against the floor. The noise barely registered. She didn't remember much of the conversation after that, only fragments. A group of hikers had reported seeing a man fall near Redstone Peak. A helicopter had been dispatched, but by the time they reached the site, there was nothing. No sign of him. Just an empty ledge and a drop so deep it swallowed the light. The officer's voice softened when he spoke about the ravine. The terrain made recovery impossible. The chances of survival were non-existent. He kept talking, but Adele had stopped listening. Her feet moved without her permission, out of the kitchen, through the cafe, past customers who turned at the sound of breaking glass. Francine called after her, but her voice was nothing more than a murmur against the ringing in Adele's ears. She made it halfway down the sidewalk before her knees gave out. The pavement was warm under her hands, rough against her palms, but she barely felt it. A strange, gasping sound filled the air, and it took her a moment to realize it was coming from her own throat. Someone helped her up. Or maybe no one did. Maybe she just willed herself back onto her feet, one breath at a time, because there was no other option. She needed to get to Iris. The next few days existed in a haze. People came and went. Neighbors. Friends. Family. Some brought food, as if a casserole could anchor her to a world that suddenly felt weightless. Others sat beside her, their hands on hers, offering words that meant nothing. "We're so sorry. He was a good man. If there's anything you need." She nodded at all the right moments, but it was muscle memory. Her mind was elsewhere, stuck in an endless loop of questions she couldn't answer. Had he suffered? Had he known he was going to die? Was he scared? Iris didn't understand. How could she? She was barely 3, still small enough to believe that everything broken could be put back together with glue and patience. She toddled around the apartment, dragging a stuffed rabbit by one ear, looking up at Adele with wide, expectant eyes. "When's Daddy coming home?" Adele had no answer. The funeral came too quickly and not quickly enough. There was no casket, just a framed photo on a table, surrounded by flowers that had started wilting before the service even began. She hated it. Hated the way people spoke about him in past tense, as if saying was instead of is would make it true. She sat in the front row, hands clenched in her lap, willing herself to keep breathing. The air in the room felt wrong, heavy, thick with the weight of loss. Merrick's best friend, Paul, stood to speak, clearing his throat before starting. "I keep expecting him to walk through that door," he admitted, voice shaking. "Make some joke about us all looking too serious." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, quiet and brief. Adele didn't join in. The service ended. People whispered condolences as they passed, hands on her shoulder, hugs that lasted too long. She wanted them to stop. She wanted the room to empty so she could scream, could demand that someone fix what had been broken. but no one could. Instead, she sat there, staring at the photo, at Merrick's familiar grin, frozen in time. He was gone. And there was nothing she could do. The kindness of friends and family had carried Adele through that first year, their hands steadying her as she learned how to move forward when standing still felt easier. They brought food, watched Iris when she needed a moment to breathe, sat beside her in silence when words felt useless. But grief didn't pay the mortgage. Sympathy didn't make up for an income that was suddenly cut in half. Bills kept coming, one after another, each envelope a quiet threat. She had held on to the house as long as she could. Selling it had felt like losing another piece of Merrick. This was the home they had chosen together, the one where they had painted the nursery walls a soft yellow before Iris was born, the one where his muddy hiking boots had always been left just a little too close to the front door. But the mortgage was relentless, and no matter how carefully she budgeted, the numbers refused to work in her favor. Packing up was an exercise in restraint. There were things she couldn't keep, things she had to part with because there was no room, no use, no sense in dragging them to a smaller space. She sold the oak dining table where they had eaten their first burnt attempt at homemade pasta. She gave away the armchair Merrick had insisted on keeping, despite its broken leg and questionable smell. She boxed up old hiking gear and donated it to a local shop, unable to bear the thought of keeping it or throwing it away. Iris had cried when they moved into the apartment, even though Adele had tried to make it exciting. "It's an adventure," she had told her, using her best animated voice. A fresh start. But Iris was too young to care about fresh starts. She wanted her old room, her backyard, her home. Over time, the apartment became theirs. The walls filled with crayon drawings, the tiny balcony became a makeshift garden with potted flowers Iris named after fairy tale characters, and slowly, they learned how to live in this new space. But it wasn't easy. Adele worked from sunrise to well past midnight, stitching jobs together in a way that barely made ends meet. At the cafe, she memorized regulars' orders before they said them out loud. At the bookstore, she stacked shelves and kept a running list of titles that made customers smile. At night, when Iris was asleep, she hunched over her laptop, doing remote bookkeeping for a small accounting firm, her eyes burning with exhaustion. It wasn't enough. One evening, while Iris sat on the floor coloring, she looked up and asked, "Mom, when is Daddy coming back?" The question hit Adele square in the chest. It had been a long time since Iris had asked about Merrick. Maybe she had assumed, as children do, that silence meant certainty. Adele set down her pen. "Oh, sweetheart." Iris kept coloring, her small fingers gripping a blue crayon. "Did he get lost?" Adele swallowed hard. "No, honey. He's gone." Iris's forehead wrinkled. But gone where? How do you explain permanence to a child? How do you make them understand something you barely understand yourself? Adele reached out, brushing Iris's hair back. "Remember when we talked about how sometimes people leave, and they don't come back?" Iris nodded but didn't look convinced. But what if he just forgot how to get home? Adele bit the inside of her cheek to keep herself together. He didn't forget. He loved you so much. Iris let out a small breath, coloring over the same spot until the paper almost tore. "I just think he should come home." Adele nodded, but there was nothing to say. The call came late, when Iris was already asleep, her body curled into a tight ball under the blankets. Adele had been in the kitchen, sorting through unopened mail, mentally preparing herself for the numbers she didn't want to see. Her phone buzzed against the counter. Unknown number. She considered ignoring it, but something made her answer. "Adele Calloway?" Her grip tightened. "Who's asking?" "This is Monroe Collections. We're contacting you regarding an outstanding balance owed by your late husband, Merrick Calloway." Her pulse stumbled. There must be a mistake. "I assure you, there isn't." The man's voice was calm, practiced. Our records show he had several unpaid debts at the time of his passing. You were listed as his emergency contact and spouse. That makes you responsible for repayment." Adele's breath came shallow. "I don't, he never," she forced herself to slow down. "How much?" There was a pause, just long enough to make her dread what was coming. Then the number landed like a physical blow. "That's not possible," she said, gripping the counter. "That can't be right." "It is. We've attempted to contact you multiple times regarding this matter. If payment isn't made, legal action may be taken." Panic curled in her stomach. "I don't have that kind of money. You may qualify for a repayment plan. But I need to remind you that failure to comply could result in escalated measures." She squeezed her eyes shut. She had heard those words before. Escalated measures. She knew what they meant. The harassing letters. The relentless phone calls. The possibility of lawsuits. "I need time," she said, her voice quieter now. "You have 30 days to make a payment before further action is pursued." She hung up without saying goodbye. Her hand trembled as she set the phone down, the air in the apartment suddenly feeling thinner, tighter. She had thought she knew the extent of their struggles. She had thought she had finally gained control over her life, even if just barely. She had been wrong. Adele sat on the couch with a stack of unpaid bills fanned out in front of her, a pen poised uselessly in her hand. The numbers blurred together, twisting into something ugly and insurmountable. The collection notice was on top of the pile, staring at her like a challenge. She picked it up, reading it again even though she already knew what it said. The total didn't change. The words didn't rearrange themselves into something less devastating. Merrick had owed more money than she had ever imagined, and now, somehow, it was hers to deal with. She pressed her fingers against her temples, breathing in through her nose and out through her mouth. The past few years had been a financial struggle, but she had thought she was managing. She had thought things were hard because life was hard, because being a single mother wasn't easy, because rent and groceries and utilities didn't care about her situation. But now, with Merrick's debts looming over her, she realized just how much she hadn't known. He had hidden it from her. The thought sat heavy in her chest, uncomfortable and sharp. Had he planned to tell her? Had he been trying to fix it on his own? Or had he intended to keep it a secret forever? She glanced toward the small shelf by the window, where a framed photo of Merrick sat beside a line of potted plants. His grin, frozen in time, only made her angrier. How could he have done this? Iris called from the bedroom, her voice thick with sleep. "Mom?" Adele pushed her thoughts aside and stood, smoothing her hands over her jeans before walking into the room. Iris was sitting up in bed, rubbing her eyes. "Everything okay?" Adele asked, kneeling beside her. "I had a dream that we went on a trip," Iris murmured. "To a place with snow. We had hot chocolate and we made a snowman. You said his name was Frederick." Adele smiled despite herself. "Frederick is a very dignified name for a snowman." Iris nodded, already drifting back to sleep. "We should go somewhere with snow." Adele tucked the blankets around her and kissed her forehead. "Maybe someday." She turned off the light and closed the door softly behind her, her daughter's words lingering in her mind as she returned to the living room. Maybe someday. Maybe, if she could figure out how to make this money stretch, if she could somehow climb out from under this weight. The next morning, she took on an extra shift at the cafe, then another at the bookstore. By the time she arrived at her evening bookkeeping job, her feet ached, and her brain felt like it had been wrung dry. The small accounting office where she worked part-time was tucked between a laundromat and a nail salon, its flickering fluorescent lights making everything feel a little too bright. She had taken the job months ago, picking up remote bookkeeping work after Iris went to sleep, but tonight she had come in person, needing the quiet space to focus. Two men sat at a nearby desk, talking over their paperwork as they sipped coffee from mismatched mugs. Their conversation barely registered until one of them mentioned something that made Adele pause. "They're hiring for the season again," the older man said, flipping through a stack of receipts. "Lundcrest Resort. Good pay. Free housing, too." Adele looked up. The other man scoffed. "I did a season there once. The money's good, but it's long hours. You barely get a break. Still, it's not bad if you need the cash." Adele's pen hovered above the ledger she had been working on, her heartbeat suddenly loud in her ears. Lundcrest Resort. She knew the name. Everyone in town did. It was the high-end ski lodge up in the mountains, the kind of place people went to when they could afford to escape reality for a while. She had never actually been there, just heard stories from customers at the cafe, seen pictures in magazines. It was the sort of place that felt worlds away from her life. She cleared her throat. "What kind of jobs are they hiring for?" Both men turned toward her, surprised. "Mostly seasonal hospitality stuff," the older man said. "Waitstaff, housekeeping, front desk. Pays well, but they expect you to work hard." Adele tapped her pen against her notepad. "And you said they cover housing?" The man nodded. "Yeah. You live on site for the season. Food and lodging are included, so you don't have to worry about rent." She glanced down at the open ledger in front of her, but the numbers didn't make sense anymore. Her thoughts were moving too fast. Seasonal work. Good money. No rent. It wouldn't solve everything, but it might be enough to buy her some time. Enough to keep the debt collectors at bay, to put something aside for Iris. She swallowed, forcing her voice to stay steady. "Where do you apply?" Adele sat at the kitchen table, tapping her pen against the edge of an application form for Lundcrest Resort. The words blurred together, lost beneath the weight of what this decision meant. The pay was better than anything she could find in town. The housing was included. It was only for a season. She would come back in a few months with money in her pocket and a little breathing room. Maybe even a chance to find something more stable when she returned. Iris sat on the floor with her coloring book, humming to herself as she shaded in a lopsided snowman. Adele watched her daughter's small fingers move the crayon back and forth, and the ache in her chest deepened. They had never been apart for more than a weekend. Iris glanced up. "Mom?" Adele set the pen down. "Yeah, baby." Her daughter held up the drawing. "This is me and you and Frederick. He's our snowman, remember?" Adele smiled. "I remember." Iris studied her mother's face. "Why do you look worried?" Adele hesitated. "I'm thinking about taking a job for a little while. It's at a place where it snows, just like in your dream." Iris's eyes widened. "A place with real snow?" Are we going?" Adele swallowed. "Well, not exactly. You'd stay with Grandma for a little while." Iris's excitement flickered, her crayon pausing mid-stroke. "Without you?" Adele nodded, forcing her voice to stay light. "It would be like a winter adventure for both of us. You'd get to stay up late with Grandma, eat cookies for breakfast, and I'd go work hard so we could save up for something really special." Iris frowned, considering this. "How long?" "A few months." Her daughter's face crumpled. "That's a long time." Adele reached over, tucking a curl behind Iris's ear. "It is. But I promise we'll talk every day. And when I come back, we'll have a big celebration. We can even build a real Frederick in the snow." Iris thought for a long moment before finally nodding. "Okay. But he has to have a hat." Adele pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Deal." 2 weeks later, Adele found herself gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly as she followed the winding road up toward Lundcrest Resort. The closer she got, the more the world around her transformed. The bare, leafless trees gave way to towering pines dusted with fresh snow. The roads, slick but well-maintained, snaked through the mountains like they belonged to another world. She had left Iris with her mother that morning, lingering a little too long at the door, smoothing her coat, checking her backpack, hugging her one last time before finally forcing herself to leave. She had barely made it out of the driveway before the tears came, but she had swallowed them back and kept driving. This was what she had to do. Now, as she crested the final stretch of road, the resort came into view, and for a moment, she forgot about everything else. Lundcrest looked like something out of a holiday postcard, massive, sprawling, all dark wood and stone, nestled against the backdrop of the snow-covered mountains. Warm golden lights glowed from the windows, and a thick blanket of white covered the grounds, undisturbed except for the occasional footprint trailing toward the entrance. She pulled into the employee parking lot, shut off the engine, and sat there for a moment, breathing in the stillness. Inside, the main lobby was just as breathtaking. A massive stone fireplace flickered warmly at the center of the room, its flames casting soft shadows across the rich wooden walls. Plush chairs and sofas were arranged in cozy clusters, and towering windows revealed a panoramic view of the slopes outside. Adele barely had time to take it all in before a woman in a crisp uniform approached, her expression polite but efficient. "You must be Adele Calloway. Welcome to Lundcrest." She nodded, adjusting the strap of her bag. "That's me." The woman smiled, handing her a folder. "I'm Evelyn, the head of guest services. You'll find your room assignment, employee handbook, and schedule inside. We have a quick orientation in about an hour, but for now, I'll show you to your quarters." Adele followed her down a hallway lined with framed photos, decades of guests bundled in winter gear, smiling beside crackling fires, posing on the slopes. The staff dorms were located in a separate wing, quieter, more functional than luxurious. Evelyn led her to a modest but clean room, small but cozy, with a twin bed, a desk, and a window that overlooked the snowy courtyard. "You'll be sharing with Elena," Evelyn said. "She's been here for a few seasons now, so if you have any questions, she's a great resource." As if on cue, the door swung open, and a young woman with dark curls and a warm smile stepped inside. "You must be Adele." Adele smiled back. "That's me." Elena plopped onto her bed, stretching her arms over her head. "So, what do you think? Ready for a season of chaos?" Adele glanced out the window, where the snow fell in slow, deliberate flakes. She didn't know if she was ready. But she was here. That had to be enough. Adele pulled her coat tighter around herself as she stepped onto the employee shuttle, still getting used to the crisp mountain air that seemed to bite no matter how many layers she wore. The sun had barely started to rise, casting a soft, pinkish hue over the slopes, and the entire resort felt like it was still waking up. The shuttle driver, a man named Roy who spoke mostly in grunts, nodded at her as she climbed aboard. Inside, a handful of other employees were scattered across the seats, most of them clutching coffee like it was keeping them alive. A girl with dark curls and a chef's coat spotted Adele and waved her over. "Hey, roommate," Elena said, sliding her bag onto the floor to make room. Adele dropped into the seat beside her, rubbing her gloved hands together for warmth. "Do I look as tired as I feel?" Elena grinned. "You look like someone who's about to start a shift at the restaurant, which is basically the same thing." They had met the night before, bonding over the cramped size of their shared dorm room and a mutual love for late-night snacks. Elena had already been working at Lundcrest for 2 seasons and had an easygoing way of making everything seem a little less overwhelming. A few seats ahead, a man in a maintenance uniform leaned his head back against the window, eyes half closed. "Don't let her fool you," he muttered. "She acts like this place is fun, but she's just trying to trap you." Elena rolled her eyes. "Adele, meet Greg. He's in charge of fixing things and crushing dreams." Greg cracked one eye open. Mostly just fixing things. Adele smirked. Good to know. By the time they arrived at the main lodge, the kitchen was already buzzing. Adele trailed behind Elena through the back entrance, dodging stacks of produce deliveries and servers tying their aprons. Okay, Elena said, steering her toward a door. Here's where I leave you. If you survive your first shift, I'll sneak you an extra dessert later. Adele exhaled and pushed through the swinging doors, stepping into the fine dining restaurant where she would be working for the next few months. The space was stunning, high ceilings, soft lighting, tables dressed in crisp white linens. The smell of fresh coffee and warm pastries filled the air, and in the distance, a massive stone fireplace crackled softly, casting a golden glow across the room. She had been a waitress before, but never in a place like this. At the cafe, customers ordered at the counter, grabbed their own napkins, and occasionally left a few crumpled bills in the tip jar. Here, everything was precise. Guests expected service that was polished and effortless, as if everything just magically appeared exactly as they wanted it. A manager named Denise, a sharp-eyed woman with a clipboard, gave her a brief tour before setting her loose. Adele tied her apron, plastered on a smile, and started moving. The first few days blurred together. She memorized table numbers, learned the menu, and tried not to panic when someone asked her for wine recommendations she absolutely did not know. She figured out how to balance trays filled with overpriced appetizers, how to weave between tables without looking frazzled, how to smile even when her feet ached so badly she wanted to cry. By the end of the first week, she was exhausted. But she was keeping up. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay. Then she saw him. It happened in an instant, so quick that at first, she thought her brain was playing some cruel trick on her. She was walking across the dining room, balancing a tray of cappuccinos, when she caught a glimpse of someone near the fireplace. A man. Sitting casually with a cup of coffee, his legs crossed, his expression unreadable. Her hands tightened around the tray. It was Merrick. Except it couldn't be. Her heart slammed against her ribs, her breath catching in her throat as she froze in place. Someone brushed past her, and she barely registered it. Her vision narrowed, locking onto him, the impossible familiarity of the way he sat, the way he held his cup, the way his dark hair fell slightly over his forehead. The room around her melted into background noise. It didn't make sense. It wasn't possible. But there he was. The tray wobbled in Adele's hands as the world around her shrank to a pinpoint. The clatter of silverware, the hum of conversation, the distant crackle of the fireplace, everything faded into a low buzz, drowned out by the pounding of her heart. The man by the fire lifted his gaze, his eyes catching hers for the briefest of moments. Her breath hitched. Merrick. Or someone who looked exactly like him. The weight of the tray suddenly felt impossible, her grip turning rigid and unsteady. She forced herself to breathe, to move, to do anything other than stand there, frozen in place, but her body refused to cooperate. The man took a slow sip of his coffee, utterly unaware that the woman standing a few feet away from him was unraveling. It had to be a mistake. A trick of the dim lighting. Some cruel illusion created by her own exhaustion. Her fingers trembled against the tray's handle, and one of the cups slid dangerously close to the edge. A sharp voice cut through the haze. Adele. Table 6. Denise, her manager, gestured toward a table across the room, her expression tight with impatience. The restaurant wasn't the kind of place where servers stood around gawking at guests, and Adele knew she needed to move. Her legs carried her forward automatically, her body acting on muscle memory even as her mind reeled. She set down the cappuccinos, mumbled something polite, and walked as fast as she could toward the break room without making it look like she was outright running. The moment she pushed through the door, she set the tray down on the counter with shaking hands. The air in the small room felt stifling, the fluorescent lights overhead too harsh, too bright. She braced herself against the counter, closing her eyes, willing her heartbeat to slow. It wasn't him. It couldn't be. Merrick was dead. She had sat through his funeral, listened to the eulogies, held on to Iris as people murmured condolences that didn't feel real. She had spent nights staring at the ceiling, haunted by the weight of his absence, by the way life had kept moving without him. And yet, she had just seen him. Or someone who looked so much like him that her body had reacted before her brain could remind her of reality. Her hands curled into fists, nails pressing into her palms. A twin. Maybe he had a twin he had never mentioned. It was absurd, but wasn't that more logical than the alternative? That Merrick had somehow, what? Faked his own death? Disappeared and resurfaced in the middle of a ski lodge drinking overpriced coffee? She let out a dry, humorless laugh. The whole thing was ridiculous. She was exhausted, and grief did strange things to people. Maybe she had only seen what she wanted to see, a desperate projection of someone she had once loved. The break room door swung open, and Elena poked her head in. "You okay? You kinda bolted out of there." Adele forced a nod. "Just needed a second." Elena eyed her carefully. "Well, Denise is on the warpath, so if you're gonna have a breakdown, make it a fast one." Adele let out a shaky breath and straightened. "I'm good." If Elena noticed how unconvincing she sounded, she didn't say anything. The rest of the shift crawled by, and she kept her eyes firmly away from the fireplace, refusing to look again. That night, long after the restaurant had closed and the guests had retreated to their lavish suites, Adele lay in bed, staring at the ceiling of her small dorm room, unable to shut off her brain. She ran through every possibility, dissecting each one until it unraveled. A stranger with an uncanny resemblance? Possible, but the way he had carried himself, the way his fingers had curled around his cup, it was too familiar. A twin? Unlikely. Merrick had never mentioned a sibling, and if he had one, wouldn't she have known? Her mind drifted, unspooling memories that had long settled into the corners of her mind. The way Merrick had laughed, head thrown back, eyes crinkled at the corners. The scar on his forearm from when Iris had bitten him as a teething baby, leaving tiny crescent marks that had eventually faded into a pale reminder. The way he had smelled, like cedar and the faintest trace of coffee, always comforting, always familiar. She could still hear his voice sometimes, could still picture the way he looked at her, as if she were the only person in the room. She turned onto her side, pressing a fist against her ribs, where the ache had settled deep. If he were alive, if, against all reason, he had somehow survived, why wouldn't he have come back? Why let her believe he was gone? She closed her eyes, but sleep never came. Adele spent the entire night replaying the moment over and over again. The way he had lifted his cup, the way his gaze had briefly caught hers before sliding away, unaware, or pretending to be. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind running in frantic circles, looking for an explanation that made sense. The idea that she had hallucinated was almost more comforting than the alternative. But she had seen him. She knew she had. By the time morning arrived, she had made a decision. She wasn't going to let it go. She was going to find him and force the truth into the light. She moved through her morning shift like an actor reading lines from a script, nodding in the right places, making coffee, setting tables, smiling just enough to keep people from asking questions. But underneath the routine, her nerves hummed, tightly wound and ready to snap. He would be here again. He had to be. The first time she caught a glimpse of him, it was from across the lobby, near the grand stone fireplace. He was flipping absently through a magazine, a steaming cup of coffee on the table beside him, his posture relaxed. Adele's stomach turned itself inside out. He looked so much like Merrick, not just his face, but the way he was. The casual, effortless way he held himself, the slight bounce of his knee, the way he tapped his fingers against the cover of the magazine as if he were keeping time with a song only he could hear. She had to force herself to breathe. Before she could second-guess herself, she stepped forward, weaving through the guests, her pulse hammering against her ribs. Every step felt like an eternity, like she was wading through thick air. She stopped a few feet away. Her mouth was dry, but she managed to form his name. Merrick? The man looked up. There was a flicker, just a flicker, of something unreadable in his eyes, but it was gone so quickly she almost doubted she had seen it at all. "I'm sorry," he said, his brow creasing. "You must be mistaken." The words landed like a slap. Her hands clenched at her sides. "That's not possible." He offered a polite, slightly bemused smile. "I think you have me confused with someone else." Adele stared at him, searching for a crack in his expression, for something to betray him. He didn't flinch. His face remained smooth, unreadable, the kind of easy denial that came with absolute confidence. If this was Merrick, he was either the best liar she had ever seen, or he genuinely didn't recognize her. Her voice caught in her throat. He shifted slightly, like he was ready to move past the awkward encounter, to go back to whatever he had been doing before she shattered his morning with a single word. She couldn't let him leave. "You," she tried again, more forcefully. "You look exactly like him." His smile faltered just slightly before he recovered. "Like who?" "My husband." Something unreadable flickered across his face. "I'm sorry," he said again, softer this time. "I don't know you." Adele felt like the ground had shifted beneath her. She wanted to yell at him, shake him, demand that he stop pretending. But what if he wasn't? What if she had just made a mistake so big, so impossible, that she was standing here accusing a complete stranger of something unthinkable? Her vision blurred at the edges. The man, not Merrick, it can't be Merrick, gave her a small, apologetic nod before turning back to his coffee, flipping the magazine page as if nothing had happened at all. Adele had never felt so unsteady in her life. Adele stood frozen, her pulse roaring in her ears as the man, the stranger, the liar, the ghost, watched her with a perfectly neutral expression. "I'm sorry," he repeated, setting his coffee cup down with careful precision. "You must have me confused with someone else." Her throat felt tight. "That's not possible." He exhaled softly, the kind of breath someone takes when they're trying to be patient. "I promise you, it is." His voice. It wasn't just similar, it was identical. The cadence, the slight rasp, the low warmth. She knew this voice. She had fallen asleep to this voice, heard it whisper secrets in the dark, felt it vibrate against her skin when he laughed. Her fingers curled into fists. "Who are you?" The man tilted his head slightly, the corners of his mouth lifting in the faintest hint of amusement, as if she were the one acting strangely. "Corin," he said. "Corin Ellis." The name meant nothing. It was smooth, generic, unremarkable. She swallowed hard. "And you, what? Just happen to look exactly like my husband?" He gave a small, polite shrug. "I guess so." Adele's breath came in short, uneven bursts. She needed something, anything, that would break the facade, something that would make him crack. "You're lying," she said. His expression didn't change. "I'm not." She could feel the weight of eyes on them, the quiet shift of guests in the lounge catching the tension between them. She forced herself to lower her voice, to shove the panic down. "What do you do, Corin?" she asked, letting the name taste foreign on her tongue. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes, but he didn't hesitate. "I'm a travel photographer. I'm here working on a project about winter resorts." It was too smooth. Too rehearsed. "Where are you from?" "Seattle." She narrowed her eyes. "Funny. My husband was from Seattle." A small smile ghosted across his lips. "Seattle's a big city." She wanted to reach across the table and shake him, to make him slip, to force him to acknowledge her. Instead, she stared at him, memorizing every detail: his dark hair, slightly tousled like it always had been, his sharp jawline, the faint crease between his brows that only appeared when he was concentrating. She had loved this face. She had kissed this face 1,000 times. She had mourned this face. And now it was sitting in front of her, pretending it had never belonged to her at all. "You don't seem surprised," she said slowly. Most people would be shocked if a stranger told them they looked exactly like their dead husband. Corin, or whoever he was, lifted his coffee to his lips, taking a slow sip before setting it down again. "I guess I have one of those faces." Adele felt her nails dig into her palms. If this was an act, it was flawless. No flicker of recognition, no hesitation. If he was Merrick, then he had somehow transformed into the kind of person who could look his wife in the eye and deny her without a moment's doubt. But that wasn't possible. Was it? Her instincts were screaming, telling her that something was off. This wasn't just a coincidence. The way he held his cup, the way his fingers tapped against the table absently, the faint smirk playing on his lips, it was too Merrick. But if it was him, then he had been planning this deception for a long time. And that terrified her more than anything else. Adele told herself she was done. She wasn't going to look at him. She wasn't going to think about him. She wasn't going to let herself get dragged into something that had no explanation, something that could only lead to madness. She lasted exactly 24 hours. The first time she saw him again, it was an accident. At least, she told herself it was. She had been coming off an afternoon shift at the restaurant, exhausted and craving nothing but a cup of tea and her bed. As she rounded the corner near the staff lounge, she spotted him sitting at the bar in the resort's cafe, speaking with the bartender in a way that looked effortless. His hand lifted to his temple, fingers rubbing lightly as he nodded at something the bartender said. Adele froze. It was such a small thing. Barely noticeable. But she knew it. Merrick had done that every time he was deep in thought, when he was making decisions, when he was debating something, when he was reading the news and didn't like what he saw. Her stomach twisted. She turned and walked away before she could let herself analyze it. The next time, it was worse. She had gone into the break room before dinner service, intending to make a quick cup of coffee before her shift. There was a single cup waiting under the espresso machine, black, no sugar, no milk. She didn't think much of it until the server beside her muttered, "Corin drinks the strongest coffee I've ever seen. No sugar, no milk, nothing. Like he enjoys the suffering." The mug in her hands suddenly felt too heavy. Merrick had always ordered the same thing. It had been a running joke between them, how he would refuse to doctor his coffee, claiming he liked it as pure as possible, while she drowned hers in cream and sugar. She set the mug down and left the break room without drinking a drop. She tried to push it aside. Tried to make herself believe that she was grasping at coincidences, that she was seeing things that weren't there because she wanted to see them. But then she saw the scar. She had been walking past the main lobby when she spotted him in one of the oversized chairs near the fireplace, holding a book in one hand and his coffee in the other. He was wearing a sweater with the sleeves pushed up to his elbows. And there it was. A small, crescent-shaped scar on his forearm. The exact same scar Merrick had. Adele's breath caught. She knew that scar. She had caused that scar. Iris had been teething, and Merrick had been playing with her, holding her up in the air, making her giggle. Then, without warning, she had latched onto his arm, biting down with her tiny, sharp baby teeth. He had yelped and pulled away, and Adele had laughed so hard she had tears in her eyes. Later that night, when she had apologized for not taking it more seriously, he had kissed her forehead and said, "It's a love bite. I'll wear it with pride." And now, this man who wasn't supposed to be Merrick, who wasn't supposed to know her, who wasn't supposed to have anything in common with her dead husband, had that scar. She barely remembered getting back to her room. Her hands shook as she reached for the handle, turning it sharply, stepping inside, closing the door behind her. She braced herself against the dresser, forcing her breath to steady. Something felt off. The air in the small room wasn't right. She looked around, scanning the space, trying to pinpoint why she suddenly felt uneasy. Then she saw it. Her nightstand drawer was slightly open. She always kept it closed. Always. She walked over slowly, her fingers grazing the handle before pulling it open the rest of the way. Her notebook had been moved. The one where she scribbled down shifts, expenses, reminders. It had been pushed to the side, just barely out of place. And beneath it, she saw something even more chilling. The small envelope of photos she kept, pictures of her and Merrick, of Iris as a baby, was facing the wrong direction. Someone had been here. Someone had looked. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she shut the drawer, backing away as if the space around her had suddenly become dangerous. She had no proof. No fingerprints. No witnesses. But she knew. And she knew exactly who she was going to start watching. The sky was an endless stretch of pale blue, the kind that only existed in the crisp, biting cold of a mountain morning. Adele pulled her coat tighter around herself as she carried a tray of silverware across the outdoor terrace, where the resort was setting up a special event for the evening. It was supposed to be simple, just a station for drinks and small plates, set against the breathtaking backdrop of snow-covered peaks. She had walked this same ledge every day for weeks. It ran along the edge of the terrace, just wide enough for staff to maneuver between the tables and the waist-high stone railing. Beneath it, the slope dropped off steeply, disappearing into a thick blanket of trees. She placed the tray down on the serving table, adjusting a stack of napkins. The air was still, peaceful, the kind of quiet she usually found calming. But something felt off. A strange pull at the back of her mind, like a whisper she couldn't quite hear. She shifted her weight, and suddenly, the world beneath her feet wasn't solid anymore. The ground gave way in an instant, her boots skidding across ice she hadn't seen, hadn't expected. The ledge, so familiar, so predictable, had turned into a trap. Her body lurched sideways. The edge was too close. The drop too steep. She grasped for something, anything, and caught the metal frame of the serving table just as her foot slipped entirely off the ledge. The weight of her own momentum yanked her forward, her stomach plummeting as she dangled, half suspended over the drop. Her fingers burned from the strain, her breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. For a split second, all she could hear was the blood pounding in her ears, drowning out everything else. Then, she wrenched herself back onto solid ground, her body slamming onto the terrace with a force that rattled through her bones. She lay there, chest heaving, her fingers still locked in a death grip around the table leg. The icy stone beneath her felt too real, too solid, too sharp against her palms. She didn't move. Didn't blink. This wasn't an accident. She knew ice. She had been careful. She had walked that path 100 times. That patch of ice hadn't been there yesterday. Her breath came in shallow bursts as she slowly pushed herself upright, her hands trembling as she brushed the snow off her coat. Had someone done this on purpose? She forced herself to look around, scanning the terrace, the surrounding slopes, the resort windows overlooking the scene. Nothing. No one. The event manager, a sharp-eyed woman named Lisa, appeared a few minutes later, clipboard in hand. She barely glanced at Adele as she walked past, calling out instructions to another server. No one had seen. Adele swallowed, her pulse still frantic in her throat. She wasn't sure what terrified her more, the idea that someone had set this up, or the fact that if she had fallen, no one would have found her until it was too late. She needed to pull herself together. The rest of her shift crawled by in a haze. Her hands still shook as she poured wine, and she could barely focus on guests' orders. Elena nudged her at one point, murmuring, "You look like you've seen a ghost." Adele forced a tight-lipped smile. If only she knew. Later that evening, after the last of the guests had retreated to their suites and the staff had begun their closing routines, she stepped into the back hallway near the kitchens, desperate for a moment of quiet. That's when she heard his voice. She stopped short, pressing herself against the wall just outside the storage room. "Corin. I need to leave soon," he was saying. His voice was lower than usual, tense. "No, not yet. It's complicated." A pause. "I said I'm handling it." Adele's stomach twisted. She didn't know who he was talking to. She didn't know what he was handling. But suddenly, she wasn't so sure she wanted to find out. Adele sat on the edge of her bed, her phone gripped so tightly in her hand that her knuckles ached. The resort staff housing was quiet at this hour, everyone either asleep or winding down from their shifts. Outside her window, the snow had started falling again, thick and slow, covering the mountain in an untouched layer of white. Her heart pounded as she stared at the number on the screen. It was late. Maybe too late. Maybe she should wait until morning. Maybe she should wait forever and pretend none of this was happening. But then she remembered the way Corin, Merrick, it had to be Merrick, had looked her in the eye and lied. The way he had denied her existence so smoothly, so effortlessly. She remembered the scar on his arm, the coffee order, the way he rubbed his temple when he was thinking. And she remembered the ice on the ledge. Before she could talk herself out of it, she pressed the call button. The dispatcher answered on the third ring. "Snowcap County Police, what's your emergency?" Adele's breath hitched. I need to report a missing person." A pause. "A missing person?" "Yes," she said, gripping the phone harder. "My husband. Merrick Calloway. He was declared dead 9 years ago. But I just saw him. He's here at Lundcrest Resort, using a different name." She expected disbelief, maybe even a quick dismissal. But the dispatcher only said, "Are you certain?" Adele swallowed. "Yes. We'll send officers to the resort. Stay where you are." She lowered the phone, her hands trembling. There was no going back now. The police arrived an hour later, their flashing lights cutting through the otherwise peaceful night. Adele stood near the entrance of the main lodge, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as she watched them step inside. The resort staff barely reacted, most of them assuming it was some small disruption, a drunk guest, a misplaced wallet, something that would be handled quietly. But Adele knew better. The moment Corin stepped into the lobby, she knew the second he saw them. He had been walking toward the fireplace, his hands tucked casually into his coat pockets, his expression relaxed, until his gaze landed on the 2 uniformed officers standing beside the concierge desk. His body went rigid. Adele's stomach twisted. The officers approached him. "Sir, we need you to come with us." Corin blinked, his expression carefully neutral. "I'm sorry, what's going on?" One of the officers stepped closer. "Your name?" A pause. "Corin Ellis." The officer's jaw tightened. "Try again." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Adele could barely breathe. Corin's eyes flicked past the officers, locking onto hers. His expression was unreadable. He didn't look angry. He didn't look afraid. If anything, he looked sad. Then, without a word, he held out his hands. The officers exchanged a glance before stepping forward, securing his wrists with handcuffs. "Corin Ellis, also known as Merrick Calloway, you're being taken into custody for questioning." Adele expected him to protest, to fight, to say something. But he only kept staring at her. And for reasons she couldn't understand, she found herself staring back. The police station smelled like burnt coffee and paperwork. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a harsh glow on everything, making the tired lines on Adele's face feel even deeper. She sat in the stiff plastic chair, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her foot bouncing beneath the table. The clock on the wall ticked in slow, unbearable increments. Across from her, Detective Mendez flipped through a file, glancing up occasionally, as if gauging her reaction. "The results came back," he said, voice calm but firm. "Corin Ellis and Merrick Calloway are the same person." Adele's hands curled into fists. She had known. Of course, she had known. But hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that shook her down to the bone. Mendez closed the folder and leaned forward slightly. "Do you want to see him?" She let out a sharp breath. "He wants to see me?" "He hasn't asked for a lawyer," Mendez said. "Hasn't asked for much of anything, really. But when we told him we had the results, he said he'd explain, if you were willing to listen." Adele let the words settle, feeling them push and pull at something raw inside her. Explain. As if there was an explanation that could justify this. As if there were words that could undo 9 years of grief. She forced herself to nod. Mendez stood and gestured for her to follow. They walked down a short hallway, past rows of desks and half-drunk coffee cups, until they reached an interrogation room. Mendez pushed open the door. Merrick was sitting at a metal table, his hands resting loosely in front of him, no cuffs, no restraints. He looked up as Adele entered, his expression unreadable. Mendez nodded at her. "I'll be right outside." The door clicked shut behind her. Adele's nails pressed into her palms. Merrick, or Corin, or whatever name he had been living under, tilted his head slightly. "I was wondering how long it would take you to find me." Her breath caught in her throat, but she refused to let it shake her. "You were wondering," she repeated, voice sharp. Like this was a game? His mouth twitched, almost like he wanted to smile, but there was no humor behind it. "No. Not a game." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, but she didn't relax. Didn't let herself settle into the space. "Talk," she said. He exhaled slowly, looking down at his hands before finally meeting her gaze. "I had to do it," he said. Adele let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "You had to fake your death?" "Yes." She shook her head, jaw clenched. "You had to disappear? You had to let me believe you were dead? Let Iris grow up without her father? Let me," her voice broke, but she swallowed it down, refusing to fall apart. "Explain it to me, Merrick. Make me understand how you looked at me, looked at our life, and decided to vanish." He didn't blink. "Because if I hadn't, you and Iris wouldn't have been safe." She stared at him. "Safe from what?" He ran a hand over his face. "From the people I owed." Adele's pulse pounded in her ears. "You had debts," she said slowly, each word cutting like glass. "You knew you had debts, and instead of telling me, you just, what? Gambled everything away?" "I was in too deep," he admitted. "It wasn't just money. It was who I owed." She felt the rage creeping into her veins, burning under her skin. "So instead of being an adult and facing it, you faked your death?" "Yes." She shot up from her chair, the legs screeching against the floor. Merrick flinched, just barely, but she saw it. "You let me grieve you," she hissed. "You let me bury you." His voice was quiet. "I know." She slammed her hands on the table, leaning in. "No, you don't know, Merrick. You have no idea what you did to me. To Iris. Do you have any clue how hard it was? How I had to sell everything. How I worked 3 jobs just to keep our daughter fed. How I had to lie to her every time she asked why her daddy wasn't coming home." His throat bobbed, but he didn't look away. "I did it to protect you," he said. Adele let out a bitter laugh. "Don't you dare say you did this for us. You did this for yourself." You ran. You ran and let me suffer. Merrick exhaled, slow and steady. I wasn't supposed to survive that fall, he said. But I did. And when I realized I had a way out, when I realized I could disappear, I took it. She gritted her teeth. And you never thought about coming back? His jaw tightened. I thought about it every single day. Adele felt something snap inside her. You don't get to say that, she spat. You don't get to sit here and act like this was hard for you. Like you missed me. Like you missed our daughter. Merrick's face twisted, just slightly, into something that looked like pain. Adele straightened, her breath shaking. She had spent years wishing she could have him back. But not like this. Not as a liar. Not as a man who had abandoned her because it was easier than staying. She turned for the door. Merrick's voice was low when he spoke. Iris. Does she know? Adele stopped, her hand on the handle, but she didn't turn around. She thinks her father is dead, she said. And maybe that's still the truth. Then she walked out, leaving him behind. Adele sat in the parking lot of the police station, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles ached. The snow outside had thickened, falling in slow, heavy flakes, blurring the streetlights into soft, glowing orbs. It was quiet inside the car, except for the sound of her own breathing, ragged, uneven, like her body couldn't decide if it wanted to scream or sob. Merrick was alive. She had spent years mourning him, breaking under the weight of his absence, clawing her way through a life that had become too heavy. She had slept in an empty bed, answered Iris's questions with lies wrapped in kindness, worked herself to exhaustion just to keep them afloat. And all this time, he had been somewhere. Living. Breathing. Building a new existence while she suffered. Her fingers trembled as she reached for her phone. She had to call her mother, check on Iris, do something other than sit here drowning in the rage clawing its way up her throat. Before she could dial, a knock on the window made her jump. She turned and saw Detective Mendez standing there, his breath curling in the cold. She rolled the window down halfway. What? Mendez shoved his hands into his coat pockets. He wants to talk to you again. Adele let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Well, that's too bad. Mendez hesitated. It's about money. Her pulse stuttered. What? He says he has enough to settle everything. The debts. The collectors. Even some for you and your kid. Adele's stomach twisted. Tell him I don't want his money. Mendez sighed. Look, I don't know what happened between the two of you, and frankly, I don't care. But if he's telling the truth, this could take a lot of weight off your shoulders. Adele clenched her jaw so tightly it ached. She didn't want to see him again. Didn't want to sit across from him and hear more excuses, more justifications for why he had left them behind. But if he had the money that could make all of this go away, could she afford not to listen? She exhaled slowly. Fine. Mendez nodded and gestured for her to follow him back inside. Merrick was waiting in the same interrogation room, sitting at the metal table like he had all the time in the world. His expression was unreadable, but his fingers drummed lightly against the tabletop, an old habit, one she had long forgotten about. She didn't sit. Didn't want to be on his level. Mendez leaned against the wall. Go ahead. Merrick's gaze flickered to hers, something cautious in his expression. I have money. Adele let out a cold, humorless laugh. Oh, do you? That's nice. His jaw tightened. Enough to fix everything. She crossed her arms. That's funny, because I've been the one fixing everything for the past 9 years. Where was this money then? His fingers stopped drumming. I couldn't use it. Oh, but you can now? He exhaled slowly. It's been hidden. Under another name. Accounts I set up before everything. Adele shook her head, her breath shaky with anger. So let me get this straight. You had money, that could have kept us from losing our house. That could have kept me from working myself into the ground. That could have, her voice broke, but she forced it back together. You could have helped, and you didn't. Merrick's face was tight. I couldn't risk using it. If they knew I was alive. She slammed her hands on the table, leaning in. Don't you dare act like you did this for us. He stared at her, and for the first time since she had found him, she thought she saw something close to shame in his eyes. Adele let out a slow, unsteady breath. Where is it? Offshore accounts, he said. Legally, it's under a different identity. But if I sign it over to you, you can do whatever you want with it. She wanted to throw something. He was handing her a solution wrapped in guilt, and she hated him for it. She hated him for everything. But she also knew what this meant. No more collection calls. No more worrying about rent. No more waking up in a cold sweat wondering how she was going to afford groceries. And for Iris. Her stomach twisted painfully. She didn't want a dime of his money. But she couldn't afford to walk away from it either. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Sign it over. Merrick nodded. I will. She turned for the door, not trusting herself to look at him any longer. As her fingers touched the handle, he spoke again. I never stopped thinking about you. She closed her eyes for a second. Then she walked out, without looking back. Snow clung to the edges of the windows, the wind whistling softly against the glass as Adele zipped up her suitcase, pressing down to flatten the last of her sweaters. The staff dorm room looked bare now, the small space that had been hers for the past few months stripped of anything personal. The pinned-up schedules were gone from the wall, her toothbrush missing from the sink, the lingering scent of Elena's vanilla lotion the only thing left behind. Elena sat on the bed, cross-legged, watching Adele struggle with the zipper. You sure you don't want to just leave half your stuff here and call it a day? Adele let out a breath. Tempting. Elena grinned, but there was something softer in her eyes. You gonna be okay? Adele didn't answer right away. The truth was, she didn't know. She had spent months looking over her shoulder, waiting for another secret to drop, for another impossible truth to unravel. She had spent sleepless nights replaying conversations with Merrick, Corin, whoever he was now, until she felt like she was going insane. And now, after everything, she was heading home with more money than she had ever imagined, but with no real idea of what to do with it. She yanked the zipper closed. I'll figure it out. Elena nodded like she believed her. Keep in touch, okay? I want to hear all about your mysterious millionaire future. Adele snorted. It's not like that. Elena shrugged. It's kinda like that. They hugged quickly, both pretending it wasn't a real goodbye, even though they both knew it was. The shuttle ride down the mountain was quiet. Adele watched the trees blur past, the towering peaks fading in the distance as they made their way back into town. She had spent every moment since signing those papers thinking about how she was going to do this. How she was going to sit her daughter down and tell her the impossible. That the man in the pictures, the father she had never really known, was alive. She could barely wrap her own mind around it. How was she supposed to explain it to a 9-year-old? The bus jolted as it pulled into town, and she forced herself to stop thinking. She would figure it out. She had no choice. Her mother was waiting on the porch when Adele pulled up to the house, a steaming mug of tea in her hands. She barely gave Adele time to get out of the car before she was pulling her into a hug, the warmth of her coat seeping into Adele's frozen fingers. You look tired, her mother said, studying her face. I am tired, Adele admitted. Her mother gave her a knowing look, but all she said was, come inside. Iris was on the couch, a book spread across her lap, her head snapping up the second she saw her mother. Mom. Adele barely had time to open her arms before Iris was launching herself forward, hugging her so tightly she almost lost her balance. "I missed you so much," Iris mumbled into her sweater. Adele pressed a kiss to her hair, holding her close. "I missed you too, baby." They stayed like that for a while, the weight of her daughter's small body grounding her in a way nothing else could. Later, after dinner, after Iris had told her every single detail of every single thing she had done in the past few months, Adele tucked her into bed, brushing her curls away from her face. "Are you staying home now?" Iris asked sleepily. Adele swallowed. "Yeah, baby. I'm staying." Iris smiled, already half asleep. Adele sat beside her for a long time, staring at the ceiling, wondering how she was going to do this. She had spent so long surviving, clawing her way through every day just to get to the next one. She didn't know what it meant to stop, to be stable, to not live paycheck to paycheck. And she didn't know what it meant to have Merrick in the world again. She took a slow breath. One thing at a time. Months passed, and slowly, things settled. Adele found a house, small but warm, with a fenced-in backyard where Iris could play. She picked out furniture, set up a little office space, made sure there were enough bookshelves for all the stories Iris insisted on collecting. She paid off every single bill, every last cent, and let herself exhale for the first time in years. Iris thrived. She started a new school, made new friends, joined an art club. And Adele? Adele learned what it meant to breathe again.